The 15th of August, 1947. At the stroke of midnight in New Delhi, Jawaharlal Nehru addresses the Indian Constituent Assembly and announces that India has awoken to life and freedom. 400 million people leave the British Empire in a single night. It is the largest transfer of sovereignty in recorded history. The British, who have administered India for the better part of 2 centuries, depart within 10 weeks of the announcement. The empire that had taken 300 years to build lasted, in its recognizable form, until roughly 1947. Most of what remained was gone by 1968. The question of why it ended so quickly is, in some ways, the wrong question. The better question is why it lasted as long as it did. This requires some explanation. At its peak in the early 1920s, the British Empire covered approximately a quarter of the world's land surface and contained something in the region of 500 million people, roughly a quarter of the human race. It included Canada, Australia, India, large portions of Africa, parts of the Middle East acquired after the First World War, and various islands, territories, and strategic positions scattered across every ocean. It was the largest empire in human history, and it was administered, in practice, by a surprisingly small number of British civil servants and soldiers who relied heavily on local cooperation to function at all. That last detail mattered more than it appeared. The First World War had damaged the empire in ways that were not immediately obvious. Britain had survived, but at considerable cost. 1 million dead, an economy strained past its limits, and a national debt that would take decades to service. More significantly, the war had required the empire's resources in ways that created expectations. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had sent armies and acquired in the process a clearer sense of their own distinct national identities. India had contributed over 1 million soldiers to the British war effort. The men who came home, having fought in Mesopotamia, Gallipoli, the Western Front, did not return with an enhanced enthusiasm for British rule. They returned with military training, political awareness, and the reasonable expectation that their contribution would eventually be recognized in concrete terms. The Indian National Congress, which had existed since 1885, shifted significantly in character after the First World War. Mohandas Gandhi had returned from South Africa in 1915, and the movement he shaped over the following 3 decades combined mass civil disobedience with a political sophistication that the British found genuinely difficult to counter. You could imprison Gandhi, and they did, repeatedly, but imprisoning a man for refusing to pay salt tax or for walking to the sea to make salt illegally was a harder thing to justify to an increasingly skeptical world than it once was. The 1919 Amritsar massacre, in which British troops under General Dyer fired into a crowd of unarmed civilians and killed several hundred, had damaged the moral case for empire in ways that no subsequent public relations effort could fully repair. The empire had always relied, in part, on a narrative of benevolent civilizing administration. That narrative had become considerably more difficult to sustain. The Second World War finished what the First had started. Britain entered the war in September 1939 as a great power with a global empire. It exited in August 1945, technically on the winning side, financially ruined, and dependent for its continued solvency on American loans that came with conditions. The national debt had reached 250% of GDP. The infrastructure had not been rebuilt. The national welfare state the Labour government had just promised, the National Health Service, comprehensive social insurance, needed to be paid for. The empire, in this context, was no longer primarily an asset. It was an administrative and military burden that required garrisoning, defending, and occasionally suppressing. India had contributed 2.5 million soldiers to the British war effort, the largest volunteer army in history. They had fought in North Africa, in Burma, in Italy, and across the Middle East. They had done so under British officers, within a British command structure, on behalf of a war effort whose stated purpose was the defeat of fascism and the defense of freedom. The contradiction between that stated purpose and the continued denial of Indian self-governance had not escaped either the soldiers or their political representatives at home. Clement Attlee's Labor government, which took office in 1945, understood the situation with some clarity. The question was not whether to grant India independence, but how quickly to do so before the situation deteriorated beyond orderly management. The answer, in the end, was very quickly indeed. The Americans were also, to put it diplomatically, not enthusiastic imperialists. Franklin Roosevelt had made this clear to Winston Churchill at their meeting aboard HMS Prince of Wales in 1941, where the two leaders signed the Atlantic Charter, a document that included, somewhat awkwardly for Churchill, a commitment to the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they lived. Roosevelt meant it, Churchill did not, or at least not for the empire. The distinction became increasingly difficult to maintain as the war progressed. The United States, that emerged in 1945 as the dominant Western power, was ideologically committed to open markets and self-determination, and an empire that kept large portions of the world closed to American trade was not an arrangement Washington was inclined to support indefinitely. The Suez Crisis of 1956 made this explicit. Egypt's President Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain and France, in coordination with Israel, invaded. They had not consulted Washington. President Eisenhower, furious at the unilateral action and concerned about its effects on American standing in the Arab world and at the United Nations, made a simple demand: withdraw. He backed this demand by threatening to withhold American support for the pound, which was under significant pressure on the currency markets. The British government, which had no ability to defend the pound without American assistance, withdrew. It took 6 weeks from the initial invasion to the complete humiliation. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention: Britain could no longer act as an independent great power without American approval. The empire that remained after Suez was an empire Britain could no longer afford to defend in the way that empire holding traditionally required. Harold Macmillan drew the appropriate conclusion. In February 1960, he addressed the South African Parliament and told them that a wind of change was blowing through the continent, whether they liked it or not. This was, for a British Prime Minister, an unusually candid acknowledgement that decolonization was not a policy Britain had chosen so much as a reality Britain had decided to manage. The African independence movement was already too large, too organized, and too expensive to oppose. Between 1957 and 1968, Britain granted independence to more than 20 territories: Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Tanzania in 1961, Kenya in 1963, and onwards through a decade of transfers that left the map of Africa substantially redrawn. Not all of these transitions were peaceful. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya had required a brutal counterinsurgency campaign throughout the 1950s. Cyprus had involved years of EOKA bombing and political violence before independence in 1960. Aden, where Britain maintained a military base vital to its East of Suez commitments, descended into guerrilla conflicts before the British withdrew in 1967 in conditions that could not honestly be described as orderly. The gap between the official narrative of managed, principled withdrawal and the actual experience of specific territories varied considerably depending on which territory you were in. In 1968, Defense Secretary Dennis Healey announced the withdrawal of British forces from East of Suez by 1971, abandoning the network of bases in the Persian Gulf, Singapore, and Malaysia that had underpinned British global reach. It was a financial decision as much as a strategic one. Britain could no longer afford the forward military presence that empire-level influence required. The announcement was, in practical terms, the moment Britain formally acknowledged that it was a European power of the second rank rather than a global one. The British framed this, at the time and subsequently, as a deliberate and principled withdrawal, a managed transition to independence conducted in an orderly fashion by a responsible imperial power that had always intended to prepare its territories for self-governance. There was some truth to this, in the sense that Britain had, in many territories, built administrative structures and trained local civil servants and lawyers who would staff the successor governments. There was considerably less truth to it in the sense that the timing and pace were largely dictated by local pressure, international opinion, and the simple arithmetic of what Britain could still afford. Why did the British Empire end so quickly? Because the structural supports that had sustained it, economic dominance, naval supremacy, the ability to project military force globally without reference to other powers, and the relative absence of organized political opposition within the empire were all significantly degraded by the First World War and effectively destroyed by the Second one.
because the nationalist movements that had been building since the 1920s reached maturity at precisely the moment when Britain was least able to contain them, because the Americans had replaced Britain as the dominant Western power and had their own views about how the world economy should be organized, and because the British, with characteristic pragmatism, largely recognized which way events were moving and attempted to leave before they were pushed. The speed, in retrospect, was not surprising. Empires maintained by consent are sustainable. Empires maintained by force against determined and organized opposition are expensive. Britain, after 1945, had neither the money nor the appetite for the latter. The Commonwealth remains. 56 countries, representing a third of the world's population, still meet periodically to discuss matters of mutual interest, exchange diplomatic pleasantries, and compete in the Commonwealth Games. Whether this constitutes a continuation of the empire in any meaningful sense, or simply a polite arrangement among countries that once shared a set of administrators, is a question whose answer depends largely on who you ask. The British, on balance, prefer the former interpretation.